I've been here a number of times in different parts of the CBS. I've been collaborating with some people here. For example, Mette Mönster for about 25 years, I think. And seeing the logo for the Academy, I'm very pleased as well, because I suppose that should represent a network, right? And what I always test audiences when we talk about researchers or practitioners, it's easier with practitioners though, is that the most important resource to an entrepreneur and small business person is the personal network. And so far nobody has opposed. Is there anybody who likes to oppose? Okay, we can take that afterwards. I also am pleased to be here because as Fleming indicated, I've been mostly concerned with entrepreneurship the recent years. But that's mainly because entrepreneurship has taken over from small businesses. That happened basically in the 80s. Before the 80s, nobody talked about entrepreneurship, not even in the States. And suddenly there were papers and conferences on entrepreneurship, and we in Scandinavia hang on to that. So it's nice to talk about small business again, because that's where we started, at least in Sweden, doing research in the field. I'm also happy to be here because for 6 months I had a contract with your Queen as a professor at Roskilde University Center. So for 6 months I was a professor in this country as well. I'm sorry that I left you for other chairs. So I'm going to reflect here, and perhaps I should underline that I have held, and I'm holding a chair at Jönköping Business School in entrepreneurship. So leadership has not been my specialty. So I suppose, since the whole conference is on leadership, I suppose we can use perhaps some of my comments or reflections to energize your discussions here. And of course I may do some bridges over to leadership as well. If what I'm saying is too awkward to you, you're welcome to interrupt me with questions, and you may put them in Danish or in Swedish or in English. So my agenda today is to first state some points of departure. Of course, I have to provide my image of leadership, and I will elaborate quite a lot of what I see as features of small, medium-sized enterprises. Then I'm going to want to comment on what about family business, especially, because in my mind most small firms, if they're not just parts of large organizations, are family businesses. And since I now work associated with the Family Business Institute at Jönköping International Business School, where we, by the way, are just about to publish a book on family business research in Sweden. I want to specifically comment on family business as a kind of social organization which is involved in doing business. I'm also going to reflect a bit on what kind of organizing will we need as digital times continue. And also comment a bit on lessons for stakeholder management, but basically stakeholders then in the firm. And finally some conclusions. Well, our common understanding and also realities of small firms and entrepreneurship was that we associated entrepreneurship with strong-willed persons, usually men, who are running businesses and were happy with that. Our understanding is also organizations, and I see another speaker is going to talk about how hierarchies are going to die. Anyway, in those days they were organized as hierarchies because that's, to some, is the most efficient structure, at least when things are not happening too fast. And these hierarchies typically describe the organization as a formal structure which was legally defended by regulation. And that, of course, also indicates that contracts in the formal sense were very common. And when we talked about the environment, possibly you could say that some organizations had a more dynamic and more uncertain environment. But thanks to strong institutions, the uncertainty created by this kind of environment could be controlled. That was how it used to be. But how is it becoming? Well, first, entrepreneurship is that's a concept which has broadened considerably. Walking the floors here before we started now, I remember when I had a presentation with Caroline Bigren, who is at Lund University today, on what we called extreme entrepreneurship. And that is the kind of entrepreneurship which we associate with people who question the existing institutions, basically breaking against the law in order to carry out their ventures. And we presented a number of cases on that. I remember that people were very curious on that. But there are, since the beginning of the entrepreneurship research in the 80s, a number of other understandings of entrepreneurship has emerged. Because the phenomenon has become visible in all sectors of society. And I'm not going to make a historical review now, but just telling that now, these days, social entrepreneurship, or as we put it for some reasons in Sweden, societal entrepreneurship has become very popular, and there are a number of journals and conferences specifically on that. So in a way, it's kind of the ultimate perspective of entrepreneurship. That is, it's a phenomenon which is of concern for all people in society. And that also means that we can't reduce entrepreneurship to individuals and strong people. Entrepreneurship is an approach to life which concerns everybody. And a lot of research is now trying to illustrate that in different kind of contexts. What is happening now when the hierarchies are dying is that it's easy to talk about organizing, where several units, as you can imagine, smaller units are linked into constellations of firms, where the boundaries are fuzzy, both between the organizations and between the individual organization and the environment. And of course, the new information and communication technology has contributed to that development. Instead of uncertain or risky environments, it's more relevant today to talk about ambiguous environments. By that, I mean that what happens can be interpreted in a number of ways, and it's rather an overload of information than lack of information. When we talk about uncertain and risky environment, we usually refer to that there's a lack of information. We have to get more information to cope with those environments. But in an ambiguous environment, it's rather that we have the basis for making different interpretation and take action accordingly. And also through the new media, and specifically the social media, then new realities are constructed all the time, which certainly have enormous implications, as we have seen now in the international public or political environment. And what is also then comes out of this perspective is that coincidences, random events may create quite different development paths. And of course, this interpretation of what is going on outside the organization can be narrated in different ways. So there are a lot of stories around which give different understandings of what is going on in the environment. And that makes it, on one hand, then ambiguous. You can interpret that in different ways. On the other hand, in my mind, that opens up even more for entrepreneurship, because there are no limits to human imagination, and that can be some sort of activated in that kind of environment. Well, you are the experts probably on what leadership is about, but to me then, because I had to have some point of reference in my reflection on the other issues I'm bringing out here, is that To me, leadership is about envisioning new futures, and then play an even more important role today than because our times are ambiguous, provide ambiguous environments. And the way to control organizations, to govern them, if you want, can only be achieved by creating a community, a feeling of community, which is based on and creates commitment. And commitment to me is to not just inspire people to take action, but also inspire people to take responsibility for their action. And some of you may know Roosevelt Moss Cantor. She has been quite, perhaps still is, I haven't followed her career, important writer on leadership. And her thesis was about commitment and community. That was a fascinating thesis, which told a story about Europeans who fled to the United States because due to their religious convictions, were not allowed to live their spiritual life here in Europe. And she then describes how that these communities were established, they were closely held, there was usually a very charismatic leader, and people really had to give up what else was around and just focus on their local practices. Well, there was a successful number of decades, but most of them died because no organization can close the boundaries to the environment. But it's certainly demonstrated the role of commitment to make it viable for these decades in the mid-19th century. But the point is that other modes of control, like process control and output control, becomes less important. That's my point in the future. And Mette Mönstad has pointed out to me that recent writing on the importance of seeing the potential of everybody in the organization, and she and her source talks about realize that there are slices of genius all over the organization. But another responsibility, and that's not the least important for family businesses, is to bring out and amplifying the capabilities of the followers. Followers, of course, generally as employees, but also in family business, the next generation. I don't know about Denmark, but in Sweden there is an ongoing discussion on what's going to happen to all our family businesses, which were established by people after the Second World War and onwards, who now are in the 60s and 70s. So this generation succession issue is very hot in Sweden now. Coming back to that. And finally, I think that's a lesson learned from entrepreneurship. And certainly we can see bridges between entrepreneurship and leadership, is that there is a need to acknowledge change as a natural state. There will always be a need for change, ongoing change. And as regards the specific linkages between leadership and entrepreneurship, researcher Barbara Czarniawska, some of you will probably know about her, would argue that what links entrepreneurship and leadership is both is about making sense making. So what about small and medium-sized firms? As I already indicated, that almost all small firms, which are not just some sort of units done within corporations, are family businesses. I think it's important to state that starting and running a family business is an existential challenge. It's about crafting an identity and making a difference. This is not just guesswork, but based on a study which I'm coming back to on successful family businesses in Sweden. I think we also have to realize that most small firms are not don't stay on being entrepreneurial. So even if they were entrepreneurial once when they were started, because starting up enter a career as an independent or business person is certainly an entrepreneurial effort. It's more some sort of demanding than introducing new products, for example. But most of them then, in a way, would say give up their entrepreneurial ambitions and rather supervise the activities of their organizations. We who are researching in small business entrepreneurship, we don't agree on very much, but one thing we agree upon is this, that perhaps 9 out of 10 new starters, they soon enough become what we may call them traditional owner-managers, not too interested in change. What is also important to keep in mind, of course, when we talk about leadership and organization, is that for natural reasons, people in small firms are very close, for good and bad. But also what is important is that research both in the States and in Sweden indicate that smaller firms are closer to their communities than large organizations. They feel, that includes feeling a responsibility for their local communities. And that, of course, is interesting, for example, in perspective of when we talk about social, societal entrepreneurship. They see themselves having a responsibility to the communities where they are located. Part of this book project, outcome of research done at Jönköping International Business School and Linnaeus University. Linnaeus University, by the way, is a quite new university. It's a merger between Växjö University and Kalmar University. So, in the introductory chapter to that book, we talk about the family business logic. And what is specific when we talk about family business? Well, first, of course, is a very active and visible ownership. I mean, a lot of researchers in corporate governance are spending both their time and research money on looking into this phenomenon. And we have quite a number of good researchers in this field, for example, Morten Hus of Norway. But in family businesses, usually the owner is also managing the firm. Usually also is not chairing the board, he is on the board. And also representing the organization in different respects, both internally and externally. What is more is that, of course, this ownership is stable, as well as leadership is. Almost, you would say, too stable, at least leadership. Because, as indicated already, succession is a very traumatic experience in most family businesses. Very seldom it's a nice and a smooth process, although there are exceptions where the generations, some sort of co-evolve the transition process from one generation to the next. But personally, I've not experienced any such nice succession processes, but usually there are extreme sad stories where, probably you know about that here in Denmark as well. But on the other hand, if these crises can be some sort of solved in a positive way, there is a great potential this long-term ownership and leadership. And I'm coming back to that as well, but the specific in the small firm that where ownership and leadership are combined is that that creates specific strength. And I did a study in the early in the 70s of the successful family businesses in Sweden, medium-sized firms. And then I followed up that 15 years later and looked how had they continued their success. And those who had continued were those firms who had stayed as family businesses, not being acquired by other institutional owners, for example. So it's obvious that the family as an institution brings strength to the firm. Well, in the next point, of course, this means that there is a long-term focus on involvement in the firm. And that creates a stability, which I would argue is needed also in these new, more turbulent times. Usually there are multiple objectives. It's not just a matter of running a profitable organization, but also a challenge to keep it, it's a challenge per se, an objective per se, to keep the family visible in the organization. But also you often hear arguments that they have a responsibility to the community, as I said, generally, but also to the employees. This independence to financial institutions makes it possible then to run the firm in this long-term perspective. I met a number of entrepreneurs who went public, but then some sort of return to be traditional, or as regards ownership, traditional family businesses, because they couldn't stand being controlled by the financial markets. In family businesses, there is a very flexible government, as those owners are also managers and also often even workers in the organization. And that creates, of course, a fantastic flexibility. And the final point then on this list is that as much as this company is part of building an identity for the owners, the business is also identified with the owner. So organizational and personal behavior are closely linked in family businesses. And some of these elements in this logic has been considered to be weaknesses in the family businesses. But as I indicated, empirical research shows rather that family businesses are more successful than non-family businesses. So summarizing the strengths of small firms and family businesses, you could say that they feed families, they also feed places because they guarantee that there is employment. And we also know that most of employment on a national basis is created by small firms. In 1985, two British researchers coined the concept of strategic awareness. And with that they meant that if there's a change in the environment, it's not just important that somebody in the organization will know about that, will observe that. But it also has to be a capability in the organization to see what kind of implication does this change in environment have on the whole organization. That kind of capability, strategic awareness, to see the implications for the whole organization of a change in the environment, is especially some sort of easy to nurture in a small business context. Another important aspect, as we know that standardization is all the time going on all the time, and it's researched very much, at least in Sweden. But as on the other hand, customization becomes more and more important, especially when we're looking to other industries than the manufacturing industry, like the experience industry. Customization becomes as well very important. And these two some sort of contrary processes, they have to be dealt with. And then this is where the small firms and the family-owned businesses, which are very flexible, have a important role to play, because they're used to improvise anyway, because there's a call for improvisation and ability to make it work, even if the situation can't be standardized. Of course, small firms contribute to smooth adaptation of societies, whether we talk about local, regional, national, or global communities. And using the full strength of small, medium-sized firms, family businesses, of course, calls them for taking advantage of what I already introduced, the notion of familyness. But before that, I think I'll comment on that. I want to say that as most of the research and also the practices are created by theories are created by academics, and norms, what should be good management, is created by big firms. It's important to reflect upon whether that some sort of is relevant also in small growing firms, what some call gazelles. So we carried out a study that was done at Växjö University, where I suppose gazelles are listed also here in Denmark, is that so? Yeah. So this was a 2004 population in Sweden. There were 1,300 firms, and about half of them would answer a survey, quite simplistic survey, because otherwise I wouldn't answer anyway, but 50% answered. And most of them were family businesses. And then we asked some sort of simple questions like, what makes you still run the firm? Is it because of the money? Is it because of you have a vision which you still are about to enact? Or is it because you want to demonstrate to the environment that you really can achieve something? And only 10% argued it's because of the money. Then we asked, and I know I've talked about this before in Denmark sometime, that then we asked them, how do you use your time? Do you use it for action, concrete action? Do you use it for making plans and following up plans? Or do you use, what part of your time do you use for imagining new visions for the firm? And back in the 70s, they spent quite little time on planning. That is what we teach at universities. They say about 20%. And then 40% on action and 40% on visions. This was back in the 70s, where change was not that dramatic in the environment. Then I have because then I did just, I should tell you, I did then case studies. And I also did case studies in the early 90s, 15 years later. And then it turned out that the time spent on vision had reduced considerably, more action. The planning was still quite little. And then this study then, in 2004, and then the part of time used for creating visions had increased even more, and more time on action. The planning was still low. And as we discussed then, I remember we were at a conference somewhere in Denmark. I mean, one obvious interpretation to my Danish friends, I think I could take good advice from you then, was that because of turbulent environments, there's no idea to elaborate too much on visions, because things are anyway changing, and planning will never do. They're obsolete once they are written down anyway. So that's a job for auditors and so forth in organizations. But the point is that these firms that are successful, they have realized this and are action-oriented. And that doesn't mean that they don't know what they're doing. I would say that that's why they are not reflecting too much, but just taking action. But that's actually something which Ralph Stacey, I think, was associated with the CBS many years ago, right? Ralph Stacey, on chaos theory. And his conclusion out, some sort of using chaos theory to understand what is going on in organizations, was that if environments are chaotic, you should take action as soon as possible on what you know. That's not, well, it's a very rough summary of what you'll say in a couple of books. Okay, then another question was about what kind of capital has been most important to the development of your firm. And probably in Sweden and Denmark, it's similar, that the politicians, they know what money is about. So they think that money is important to promote small business and entrepreneurship. But answering that question, 90%, but even 95% of the entrepreneurs, because they are still entrepreneurs, argue that it's not about money, that it's not access to financial resources which have created their success. It was their focus on social capital and human capital. Social capital or trust capital then it's about networking, focusing on networking. And human capital is both experience and formal knowledge. It was about equal. Actually, human capital was considered to be a bit more important. And finally then, I mean, there are different, it's a very popular instrument in entrepreneurship research to look into the entrepreneurial orientation of persons and organizations. And there's the argument that you have to be proactive to be entrepreneurial oriented. I always oppose to that because I think you should be interactive, have a dialogue with the environment. And of course I was very happy when it turned out that the majority of these successful entrepreneurs considered interactivity to be the most important thing. Of course you can't be reactive to be successful, but you shouldn't be proactive. You shouldn't impose your solutions on the environment. You should establish dialogue with the environment. So, but as I hope behind my words here was the perhaps not too hopeful, not too implicit assumption that this goes against what is taken for granted as regards ideas about how firms should be managed, since those ideas are based on what we know from big firms. I mentioned the notion of familyness, which is very difficult to, I'm happy I can say this in English because it's very difficult to find a good Swedish name concept. If you can find a Danish one, please tell me so I can try to translate within the Scandinavian community to Swedish. But the point with familyness is that, again, what have been very much discussed, that a problem with family businesses is that they have to find a bridge between family interests and business interests. But rather than seeing that as this is a weakness, this should be considered as a strength. Because the family, of course, represent a very important source of energy. Again, this notion of commitment. A number of people in the organizations who have an interest beyond their role, the role expectations they have, but are involved in different respects. So some sort of combination of business, or if you want, rational concerns, and irrationalities like values and emotions, they combine in the family businesses. And of course it may create problems, for example in succession situations, as I indicated, but it certainly also creates opportunities and provides energy. This familyness also means that it's easier, and that of course goes back to what I already said before, but this is a way to summarize the specific notion of familyness, is that it facilitates integrated action between owners, managers, and employees. Of course, there's a dark side to this as well. It's not always in the favor of employees. For example, one weakness or dark side, if you want, of family business is that if you're not part of the family, it's difficult to make a career inside the family business. But please forgive me that I haven't taken the time to also to elaborate on the dark sides even further. And as I indicated, this familylessness can then this relationship between the small family business and the community becomes understandable if you sort of acknowledge that firms are in different respects very local. I would even say that entrepreneurship is very local because for practical reasons. If you travel all the time, you'll never be able to produce anything. So you're stuck to place in a way. And stuck to place is not just the business and the owner and the top management, but the whole business. is some sort of rooted in the local community. And that brings certain that makes this demonstrated responsibilities for the community very natural. And that builds a kind of solidarity between the organization, the owners, and the place. And these are aspects of familyness, which finally has been discussed even by American researchers. Well, if we, the notion of virtuality, I interpret a very broad respect here, and I rather some sort of demonstrate different interpretations of that notion. But of course, when we move into this digital time with a completely new information communication technology, even small and medium-sized firms or entrepreneurship has to appear in different shapes. First, I think it's of course important to state that this makes initiative, the arenas for initiatives of different kinds, for creative organizing, which I associate with entrepreneurship, even much easier. And one reason for that is that it's much easier to experiment, to learn experientially through the web than do it in reality. It takes much less effort. And also then it follows from that in the literature there's very much discussion about how difficult it is to enter the market as a firm. But again, the new information technology makes it much easier. The entry costs are lower. But I think also important to know that the exit costs are lower. You can, I mean, this gives you an opportunity. The new technology gives you an opportunity to run ventures as projects, which I think is actually a basic metaphor for understanding entrepreneurship. I mean, most entrepreneurial processes could be considered as interlinked projects. Also, well, I have some data from Sweden indicating that, is that we know from statistical surveys, I haven't got the most recent one, but some years ago I had a reason to participate, for example, in a Latin American Southeast Asia study. For example, how old are people when they start their businesses? And it turned out to be almost exactly as in Sweden. On the average, people are between 35 and 40 years old when they start their first business. Now, and that is an inverted U-shaped curve, if you can imagine the graph. So when they are middle age, they start their firms. We could imagine in the future, because of the new technology and other factors, that we will have a U-shaped curve instead, that young people start businesses and old people start businesses, while those being middle-aged are fully busy with taking care of the children, because we know that we had our children when we were in the early 20s, and now people are in the late 30s. And there are more, that's a big project, getting children, when they used to get companies or make companies, if you can understand the parallel. And so there are some indication, for example, that the fraction of retired people who start businesses is going up in Sweden, just to give you one example. And we know also that young people are more alert using the new technology, running different kind of projects. It's also interesting because the project being established will probably being less just business focused, being more socially oriented. Young people are very interested in social projects. We have experience in Sweden. What's also interesting, I think, in the future, we'll sort of elaborate even more, is that that running a business, starting and running a business is not some sort of once you do definitely. You may move up in and out of that kind of career. I have been very inspired by Thomas Høyroth, a Danish researcher who talks about different, let's call it forms of life or modes of life. You may, some sort of your basic attitude or your practice Maybe that you are a wage earner, you may be an independent business person or a farmer, independent, running something independently, or you may be, as your approach to life, your practice, be a career-oriented. So Thomas Höjer talks about these three forms of life here, and has, of course, Denmark as an empirical case. The wage earner career, way of life, form of life, the independent form of life, and the career form of life. And Anne-Mette Jallager and Gert Lindgård made just demonstrate the usefulness of having this approach to understanding small business and entrepreneurship. They made a very interesting study on how would the support of small firms vary depending on whether the one starting business is some sort of belongs to the wage earner form of life, or whether he or she belongs to the career form of life. But the point I want to make here is that it's not some sort of definitive decision to start a business. You shouldn't expect people to stay in business, so to say. That you could expect them to go up, in and out, and get, in that way, build their own personal or mixed career. So this is what I would expect to happen in the future. A Norwegian guy, Jon Sørli, I think he was a practitioner when he wrote a paper, or perhaps it was the academic report, I don't remember any longer. Anyway, the title is nice, Papirlöst ledarskap. This is back in the 1980s, for information. But the point is that running a small firm means that you avoid documents, papers. And I think he was to the point in that writing. Still I'm reminded of that that's the truth still. But with the new information and communication technology, I think this is just emphasized that papers are not important any longer. I can see that my younger colleagues very seldom print something out of a computer. I do it all the time. I need the paper as well as what is on the computer. So, but basically, dialoguing. I mean, I don't write letters any longer. Don't be afraid, I'm not that old. But I mean, because now my dialogues I can carry out on the computer. But as I indicated already, I think networking has is even more emphasized, and networking, that is building and maintaining trust, is more important in my mind than formal negotiations. That could probably debate it, but that's my experience. I mean, if you write a contract, ask for a contract, people lose trust in you. Why do we need a contract? Don't you believe me? I think that's very interesting. It's a negative implication of formal contracts. But what is also, I think, more important now, the last point here, is that what some call swift trust. An ability to very quickly establish a trustful relationship. I think that becomes a very important capability in these times when things are happening so fast. So I would argue, instead of saying that digital times would replace personal networking, I think it even enforces personal networking. I think, considering again the symbol for this organization, I think you would agree on basically on this. First, personal networking is very important because out of the personal network, the new firms emerge in the first place. Personal network is the way, and the way it's used is the way the new entrepreneur creates a new identity which follows from entering a career as an independent business person. You are your personal network. Through the personal networking, you do the very important social learning and also bring resources to the firm by outsourcing through trustful relationships. And also, it's only people you know well, friends in your personal network, which you accept critical comments from if you are an owner manager, because you are some sort of have a strong belief that you know everything that is needed. But good friends can tell you that you have to change. I think that's very important that owner managers have that kind of network. And you could, of course, argue that we don't need that kind of personal networking now in digital times, because you can replace a lot of the encounters, personal encounters, with interaction through the web. But for sure, digital relating is like love without kisses. I would never replace all my relationships. I even brought my wife to Copenhagen this time. Also, I think trust is not something you can sort of describe in words. It's a matter of genuine encounters where you use all the modes you can have as a human being to communicate. We talk about the personal chemistry that has to fit between two people before real trust emerges. And I also think that if you think that intuition sometimes are needed, and that's a debate going on now, basically, that in this world where there's information overload, you can never analyze it. There's no time for analyzing. You have to trust your intuition. And intuition is something, in my mind, that you build through experience and listening to others. So personal networking increases your capability of making intuitive decisions, which are increasingly important. And when you do that jointly with others, then of course nothing else but a handshake can confirm that agreement you made. When we talk about the new technology, of course, the ability to bridge different distances is very much discussed. And even the small firms I have started in places like, similar to Herning in Sweden, they have now even production units in China. But whether we talk about personal encounters or encounters over the web, I think there is a need for a different perspective on time, which philosophers at Copenhagen Business School have reflected upon also. The notion of chaos. I mean, the idea that time is linear, that we can talk about stages and so forth, is in my mind, belongs to an old thinking which doesn't work when things are changing as fast as they do. So instead, the notion of kairos indicates that we have to have an ability to see the right moment to take action. Timing is more important than time as a linear process. And I think that has, of course, important implications, not just for entrepreneurs or small business managers, but also generally for leadership. Also, in a digitalized world, demand and supply can directly be linked. I mean, you know that all these websites where you can buy and sell. And I think that's interesting because that in some respect replaces entrepreneurship, because some schools' theories of entrepreneurship presents the entrepreneur as a broker between suppliers and customers. So that can be some sort of organically organized. We don't need, people can do their own organizing, being their own entrepreneurs. Also, of course, something which is appearing in one part of the world will immediately be able to communicate to the rest of the world. And that, of course, gives ideas about how to commercialize ideas and how can you control your own interests. And also social media, as we have seen, I think I mentioned that before, is not just revolutionizing the business activities, but also the whole world and changing the government of states, and that can even happen overnight. Virtual organizing, through the new information and communication technology, will of course challenge formal structures. And some others, when we talk about virtual organizing, they talk about branding as an instrument for that, where different organizations build constellations which together promote a certain brand. So a positive interpretation of that is that all those building that constellation will contribute. They're not just being passive subcontractors. I think more and more it's realized that all members of the constellation should be able to contribute, have unique competences, and not being there because they are more cost efficient, which is the traditional perspective on small firms, by the way. That the only thing they can manage is to be subcontractors. We can also imagine that the traditional perspective on the value chain as a basis for the logistics and even broader thinking about how to produce and distribute is replaced by what Richard Norman and Rafael Ramirez call the value star. That you put the customer in focus, and out of that you organize whatever that customer will need on a temporary basis, involving different other organizations in that constellation you build just for that customer. And that is what they call the value star. But more generally organized, not just on the market, but in the organization, you can also say that these times will call for a different kind of organizing. One concept, Bunsha, is that a concept you have used here at CBS? Are you familiar with that? No, that's the idea that you start off with the hierarchy. Typically, the example I have in mind is a software company in Sweden which explicitly have introduced that. It was a company of about 300 people, and they had some problems, a bit of inertia, probably because the entrepreneur was too dominating. And then he got the recommendation by some people who knew about the notion of Bunsha. That's a Japanese idea. And the idea is that you split the organization into a number of small firms. But ownership stays still centralized. But as this entrepreneur said, then these 300 or 400 people were put into 25 different companies. And he said that increased commitment, because then he had 25 people who could put CEO on the business card. And that created pride and more action. Adhocracy is to, there's no time to go into depth, but that's basically a project organization in different ways. And heterarchy is also a concept which is developed by Scandinavians, the Norwegian and the Swede. There are different interpretations of that as well, but the one point is that the leader, who is the leader, depends on what the challenge is. So the leadership is moving in the organization. Another aspect of heterarchy would be that you should accept tensions in the organization. Creative tensions are good for making the organization enough dynamic to cope with even more dynamic environments. Another message which comes out of long learning here is that I think we have to consider entrepreneurship as genuinely collective. First, which is not here, I mean, new firms crystallize out of the personal network of the entrepreneur. I can defend that if you have a question on that. The family is, of course, a collective, and without the family it's very difficult. The support of the family, especially men as entrepreneurs, are very dependent on the family running their businesses. And the wife, and Mette Mönster has written a very interesting report on that from Copenhagen, right? Copenhagen. The main source of new products, according to studies I made in Sweden, is critical customers. So the dialogue with customers create product development or stimulates product. And that's even a dialogue between two parties is a kind of collective. I would say that in locations like Herning, most firms are quite traditional. I could even put the hypothesis that there are quite square companies. but the very interaction between the firms, that I hope it's still there in Carnegie, makes any business community entrepreneurial. And finally, my argument is that, and that's a challenge for schools, is that we are naturally born entrepreneurs. We were all entrepreneurial when we were children. In our playing, we were entrepreneurial. We were creative, we were social, we took initiative, we took responsibility. What happens to that in school? What I think is specific now, leadership challenges in small and medium-sized firms, is that I mean, all young people are digital natives, and if we talk about family businesses, I mean, hopefully this can some sort of reduce the problems with succession, that the older generations will realize that we need the young generation to learn the new perspective on life, because it's a matter of perspective on life, by involving our younger people from the younger generation. I think, as I indicated, experience and with that intuition will be more important, which is a contradiction at the first sight in these overloaded with respect to information times. But I think, as again, there will never be time to do analysis which we are used to. We have to take action, and that has to be based on intuition. I think it's important to realize that, again, because of this distributed entrepreneurship, that people with ideas very easily can communicate them, and then there has to be an ability of organizations to build an absorptive capacity. And again, that's a concept from the academic literature, which means that the organization is ready to not just some sort of realize that something is going on, but also to integrate that in their own organization. And I think all organizations in the future will have to develop their absorptive capacity, because only a minor part, however big the company, it can be done inside the company. It has to sort of join in with the environment, use the environment to cope with the environment. And also, which is important, especially for small firms, family business, is that, of course, it's nice if you can do something which is unique, but you also have to gain legitimacy. You have to be accepted by the customers, and that's probably a bigger problem for many than doing something which is unique. I think also, as regards leadership in this perspective, is that we have to go see that being part of a society, and this concern for social entrepreneurship, I think, reflects that. Leadership must go beyond business operations. And one aspect, of course, which is as much inside as outside the organization, is that women must be made more visible in the small business context. In this book, upcoming book, there are a couple of chapters on the problems of women being accepted inside the organization, or even visible inside the organization, or how they appear in mass media also reflects a quite distorted understanding of what women may contribute to in the family business context. It's important not just to communicate with customers, for example, as I indicated, but also with other stakeholders in society. If we are going to some sort of maintain in our small countries a capability to build competent firms, I think we have to consider what we do at schools with our entrepreneurial kids and find ways of preserving their entrepreneurial selves. And I know Denmark was quite early with these concerns. And in Sweden now, that's even in the law now, that all children entrepreneurship should be included on the curriculum. That's in all schools in Sweden. that how it's not practiced, and especially not the teachers' colleges accept this. So this is a really challenge, at least in Sweden. And finally, of course, we have to be aware that social media may turn everything upside down very soon. So my conclusion, which the chairman indicated I should run into. Some talk about the edge of chaos. I would say the edge of chaos is everywhere and always. I think it's important to realize that small and medium-sized firms are energizing the economy and even a stabilizer in a very turbulent world, because they are not doing just business, they are also socially integrated in society. I think leadership in small and medium-sized firms in the future has as much to do with the relations inside the company as in the environment. You have to be involved outside the company as a leader. And that's basically what the last point also emphasizes, that it's difficult today to separate between economic and social issues when you are running a small and medium-sized firms. Thank you.